Your wife's been gone for years. Darling. Time to modernize and join the real world. Cordelia Whitmore said it loud enough for her phone camera to catch every syllable. Her voice slicing through the morning fog as if grief itself were an outdated inconvenience. The bulldozers behind her roared to life at dawn. Diesel fumes rolling across my pasture like an invasion force. No warning. No consent. Just steel tracks chewing into land that had fed my family and my cattle for generations. Concrete dust hung in the air, while workers poured the first slab of what she proudly announced was an $8,000 community wellness bike path, slicing straight through my active grazing field. The grass beneath their machines wasn't decorative landscaping. It was feed for 30 registered Black Angus that depended on rotational grazing to survive the season. This is working ranch land, I shouted, my boots sinking into churned soil as I stepped toward the machinery. Cordelia didn't flinch. She smiled. She held up a stack of papers, waved them at the camera, and smirked like a queen displaying a conquered banner. Easement rights. Sweetie, perfectly legal. Your cows can graze somewhere else. Progress doesn't wait for stubborn widowers. What she didn't understand was simple. This wasn't just land. This was Taurus's territory. For 6 years, my prize, bull, 2,200 pounds of muscle, instinct, and dominance had ruled that field. Bulls don't negotiate. They don't recognize vanity plates, luxury vehicles, or suburban entitlement. They protect what's theirs. And 3 months later, her husband's brand new Tesla was reduced to twisted, uninsurable scrap metal. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Dutch Kellerman, and I've been raising cattle on this land since before most of these people knew the difference between a bull and a steer. I'm a third-generation rancher. Inherited 47 acres from my grandfather back in 1995. Been running registered Black Angus ever since. For 28 straight years. I watched the sun rise over the same pasture, painting the grass gold while cattle shifted and snorted. Waiting for feed, I knew every fence post, every low spot where rain pooled, every oak tree that offered shade during brutal Texas summers. The smell of morning hay still reminds me of Sarah. My wife passed 18 months ago. Cancer doesn't announce itself politely. It arrives fast, ruthless, and final. One year, we were arguing over whether to repaint the barn. The next, I was standing alone in a kitchen that felt too quiet, reaching for a second coffee mug that no one would ever use again. Some mornings, I'd catch myself clipping articles from the local paper, thinking. Sarah would laugh at this, only to remember there was no one left to tell. Grief stretches time in cruel ways. Days crawl. Years vanish. Silence becomes heavier than noise ever was. That's when Willowbrook Heights arrived. They came like a suburban infection. 200 cookie-cutter houses sprouted where hayfields used to be. Identical rooftops. Identical mailboxes. Lawns manicured to emerald perfection with chemicals strong enough to make earthworms flee. Each house cost more than my entire herd combined. Suddenly, I had neighbors who wanted the aesthetic of rural life without any of its reality. People who complained about roosters crowing at dawn but paid premium prices for farm-fresh eggs at organic grocery stores. Folks who wanted open views, but not livestock. Quiet nights, but not working land. And leading that charge, like a general who'd mistaken herself for a queen, was Cordelia Whitmore. Cordelia was 49 years old, former corporate lawyer, 3-term HOA president. She drove a white Tesla Model X with vanity plates that read EcoFam, wore designer yoga pants like battle armor, and spoke to everyone as if they were junior associates, wasting her billable hours. She moved from California after her husband, Brad, landed a high-paying tech executive position, brought that uniquely West Coast flavor of passive-aggressive authority with her, the kind that turns simple neighborly conversations into email threads longer than legal contracts. Every dispute was a compliance issue. Every disagreement required documentation. Every threat arrived via certified mail. Comic Sans letterhead. No less, nothing says reasonable like threatening lawsuits and playful typography. It started small. Noise complaints about cattle lowing at dawn. Certified letters about agricultural odors affecting property values. Formal demands that I relocate my livestock operation to a more appropriate location. Translation, leave. What she didn't expect was resistance. What she definitely didn't expect was that I understood property law better than she did. Easements aren't magic words. They're legal instruments with strict definitions. Emergency access does not equal recreational use. And converting one into the other requires approvals, studies, and most importantly, landowner consent. But Cordelia found an old document buried in county records, a 1960s emergency vehicle easement, and she decided that was close enough. The real line was crossed on a cold Tuesday morning in October. I stepped outside with my coffee and found surveyors already marking trees. Bright orange paint sprayed across oak trunks older than her entire bloodline. Stakes hammered into soil without permission. No phone call. No knock on the door. Just trespass with blueprints. Excuse me. I called out. You're on private property. The lead surveyor didn't even look up. HOA infrastructure project. Sir, we have authorization. That's when I saw her. Cordelia stood by the fence line, filming. Lips curved in quiet victory. She thought she'd won. She didn't know she'd just triggered a war. Within 48 hours, the legal threats escalated. A thick envelope arrived, certified mail. Return receipt requested. A cease and desist accusing me of interfering with municipal development. Threats of enforcement. Property seizure. Livestock removal. Her lawyer's office address traced back to a strip mall between a nail salon and a payday lender. Confidence inspiring. That letter was the moment I stopped reacting and started planning. Because here's the thing, most HOA tyrants don't understand. Farmers survive by planning for worst-case scenarios, and I'd been doing that my entire life. That letter was the moment I stopped reacting and started planning. Because when someone decides they can erase your life with paperwork and confidence alone, the only way to survive is to understand the rules better than they do and then let them destroy themselves by following those rules to the letter. I drove into town that same afternoon and sat across from Mackenzie Reeves, a local agricultural attorney whose office smelled like old books, strong coffee, and people who had won fights they were never supposed to win. She didn't interrupt once while I laid everything out. Didn't smile. Didn't shake her head. Just listened and took notes with the kind of calm that comes from experience. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said something that changed the trajectory of the next 3 months of my life. Dutch, they don't have a case, but they're counting on you not knowing that. She spread Cordelia's documents across her desk, tapping the supposed easement like it was already dead. Emergency access only. No recreational language. no conversion filings, no environmental review, and most importantly, no valid consent. Then she held up the signature page and let out a slow breath. This signature isn't yours. It wasn't even close. Wrong slant, wrong pressure, wrong spelling. Cordelia hadn't just overreached. She'd committed fraud. And she'd done it sloppily. The way people do when they've bullied their way through life without consequences. Mackenzie explained that converting an emergency easement into a public bike path required a process so slow and bureaucratic it drove developers insane. Which is why HOA presidents like Cordelia preferred shortcuts and intimidation. She also explained something else that stuck with me. You don't need to stop them, she said. You need to let them proceed without your interference. That's where the liability forms. So I did exactly that. I stopped yelling. I stopped blocking. I stopped engaging. I documented everything. Photographed every tire track. Logged every conversation. Saved every email. When Cordelia sent letters accusing me of obstruction, I responded politely, asking for copies of permits and approvals she could never produce. When contractors showed up, I informed them in writing that they were operating on private land without consent and that any damage would be documented for their insurance carriers. Then I stepped back and let them keep going. Cordelia mistook my silence for surrender. Her confidence grew louder, more theatrical. She posted videos about bringing the community into the modern era. Filmed herself walking the path route like a victory parade, always careful to angle the camera so my pasture looked abandoned instead of alive. What she didn't realize was that every step she took deeper into my land tightened the legal noose around her own neck. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued. Because cattle don't care about HOA politics, feeding schedules don't pause for legal threats, and Taurus, my bull, remained exactly where he'd always been, dominating the center of the pasture like he owned the horizon. Bulls establish territory the way humans establish habits. Slowly and absolutely. For 6 years, that field had been his feeding ground, his resting place, his psychological map of the world. Construction noise agitated him at first, but animals adapt faster than people expect. The real problem wasn't the machinery. It was the disruption of routine. Temporary fencing appeared without warning, narrowing grazing lanes, pushing the herd closer to the tree line. One afternoon, a contractor left a gate unsecured. Taurus tested it. It held. The next day, another worker parked too close to the fence line during feeding time. Engine running. Alarms chirping as he locked the doors. Taurus lifted his head, ears forward, muscles tightening. I noticed. Logged it, and said nothing. Mackenzie had warned me that interference would weaken our position. Cordelia escalated anyway. Environmental complaints came next. Claims about water contamination, runoff, public safety. She hired a consultant whose credentials fell apart under basic scrutiny. But she blasted his conclusions across HOA emails like gospel. I responded by requesting third-party testing through state channels. The results came back clean. Cleaner than the subdivision's chemically saturated runoff. In fact, that didn't stop her. She pivoted to intimidation. Security patrols appeared at the edge of my property, filming, posturing, trying to provoke a reaction. I didn't give them one. I installed cameras instead. Every night I slept lighter. Not because I was afraid, but because I was waiting. There's a moment in every long conflict where you realize the other side is no longer thinking rationally, where pride overrides strategy. Cordelia hit that point when she announced the celebratory launch of the bike path at the annual HOA meeting. Public event. Media invited. She wanted a win she could display. Mackenzie read the announcement twice and smiled without humor. She's about to finalize her own downfall, she said. By then, insurance carriers had been notified. Contractors had started asking questions. County officials were quietly distancing themselves. Cordelia didn't see any of it. She was already rehearsing her speech. The evening of the meeting arrived warm and windless. The community center parking lot filled early, and Cordelia, exactly as predictable as entitlement always is, parked her husband's Tesla along the edge of the lot, nose angled toward the pasture, close enough to the fence that the alarm chirped when she locked it. That sound cut through the air, sharp and metallic, echoing across the field at exactly the wrong moment. Feeding time, Taurus lifted his head. The temporary fence, improperly installed by contractors rushing to finish before dark. Bowed under pressure, it was never designed to handle. I stood where I was, hands in my pockets, camera recording. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I didn't interfere. Liability is a quiet thing when you know where it belongs. Taurus surged forward. Not in rage, but in territorial certainty. His mass hitting plastic and aluminum like they were paper promises. The sound of tearing metal drowned out the first screams from the parking lot. By the time anyone reached the car, it was already over. Insurance adjusters would later describe it as an unfortunate interaction between livestock and improperly secured infrastructure. Cordelia called it sabotage. The law called it negligence. In standing there, watching the dust settle, I realized something unexpected. For the first time since Sarah died, my chest didn't feel hollow. It felt steady. Because I hadn't won by becoming her, I'd won by refusing to break the rules she thought she could ignore. That steadiness didn't last long, though, because the moment the Tesla stopped screaming and the dust settled, reality came crashing back in waves of accusation, outrage, and performative shock. Cordelia shrieked loud enough for half the parking lot to hear, her voice cracking between fury and disbelief as she pointed at me like I'd personally guided Taurus by the horns. People filmed, phones came out. Someone yelled that I'd planned it. Someone else yelled that the fence had been flimsy all week. I stayed exactly where I was. Hands visible. Posture relaxed. Doing the one thing Mackenzie had drilled into me over and over again, nothing. The police arrived within minutes. Not because of the bull, but because Cordelia called first and loudest. Spinning a story about deliberate endangerment and agricultural assault like she was narrating a courtroom drama she expected to win by volume alone. I gave my statement calmly. Pointed out the temporary fencing installed by HOA contractors. The documented notices I'd sent warning them of livestock presence. The feeding schedule publicly posted on my gate. The camera footage, timestamped and unedited. The officer listened, nodded, and asked Cordelia for permits she didn't have. That was the first crack. Over the next 48 hours, the story flipped. Insurance investigators determined the contractors were operating outside approved plans. The HOA's carrier issued a reservation of rights letter faster than Cordelia could post her next rage-filled update. Mackenzie filed for an injunction, not to stop the bike path, but to preserve evidence. That move alone froze everything. No construction, no cleanup. The mangled Tesla sat exactly where it was, wrapped in yellow tape like a monument to hubris. Visible from the road. Photographed by locals who'd already picked sides. Cordelia spiraled. She sent emails accusing me of weaponizing grief, of hiding behind livestock, of sabotaging progress. Mackenzie responded once, attaching copies of forged signatures, unauthorized filings, and financial discrepancies she'd quietly been gathering for weeks. That's when the real panic set in. Emergency HOA meetings were called without quorum. Board members resigned mid-session. Vendors started demanding payment up front. County officials opened formal reviews. And buried beneath the noise was the thing Cordelia never anticipated: people talking to each other without her controlling the narrative. Neighbors who'd avoided me for years started asking questions. Longtime residents remembered how the land used to be before Willowbrook Heights existed at all. One by one, they realized the bike path had never been about wellness or community. It was about control. Mackenzie uncovered the rest quickly once the pressure was on. Misallocated funds, inflated invoices, payments routed through shell vendors tied back to Cordelia's husband. The HOA wasn't just overreaching, it was bleeding money. And Cordelia had been holding the knife. The county stepped in, then the state. What followed wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. No handcuffs at dawn. No shouting matches. Just subpoenas, audits, depositions, and the slow, grinding sound of consequences finally catching up. Cordelia tried to fight it. Of course, she always did. But entitlement collapses when it runs out of other people's money. Within months, she was removed as HOA president by emergency vote. Her law background, once her weapon, became her liability, as every document she'd touched was scrutinized line by line. The forged easement was invalidated. The bike path was rerouted entirely off my land at the HOA's expense. The Tesla was written off as a total loss. Insurance denying coverage due to negligence and misrepresentation. The civil suits came next. I didn't celebrate when the settlement papers were signed. I felt tired. But it was the good kind of tired. The kind that comes after holding your ground for longer than you thought you could. The ranch grew quiet again. Fences were rebuilt properly. Taurus went back to being just a bull. Not a symbol. Not a headline. Some mornings I still reach for that second coffee mug. Some losses don't fade, but when the sun rises over the pasture now, nothing cuts through it. No engines, no cameras, just cattle, grass, and the steady rhythm of a life that refused to be erased. Cordelia moved away not long after, the way people like her always do, leaving behind unpaid fees and a community forced to reckon with what it almost let happen. Willowbrook Heights learned something expensive. Progress doesn't come from bulldozers and arrogance. It comes from understanding where you are and respecting what was there long before you arrived. And as for me, I still raise cattle on this land. Still walk the fence lines at dawn. Still know every inch of ground beneath my boots. Because some territories aren't claimed by paperwork or power. They're claimed by patience, memory, and the refusal to step aside when someone tells you your life is outdated, because once the noise died down and the immediate chaos faded back, what followed was the long, grinding middle that nobody ever tells you about. The part where victory doesn't feel like victory yet, and loss hasn't fully settled either. Just a heavy in-between where every morning starts with another envelope, another email, another quiet realization that the fight is far from over. Cordelia didn't disappear after the Tesla incident. She transformed, shedding the performative confidence and replacing it with something colder and more dangerous. A version of herself that no longer cared about being liked or even believed. Only about inflicting enough damage that I would regret ever standing my ground. She flooded the county with complaints, not just about cattle this time, but about zoning violations, fire hazards, animal welfare concerns. Even historical preservation claims twisted so badly they bordered on parody, and each one required a response. A hearing. A form. Another afternoon, sitting in fluorescent-lit offices while strangers debated whether my life counted as inconvenience or nuisance, Mackenzie warned me this was the pressure phase, the part designed to exhaust rather than defeat. Because if she couldn't win cleanly, Cordelia intended to win by attrition, by burying me under process until grief and fatigue did what intimidation couldn't. There were nights I lay awake listening to the wind move through the pasture, wondering how many more months I could keep waking up, ready to defend something that seemed so obvious to me and so negotiable to everyone else. The ranch stopped feeling like refuge and started feeling like a courtroom without walls. Every fence line, another argument waiting to be made. Every animal, another potential exhibit. Even neighbors who supported me kept their distance. Not out of malice, but fear. Because Cordelia had turned disagreement into spectacle. And nobody wanted to be her next target. She showed up at public meetings armed with binders, charts, selective photos taken at unflattering angles, painting me as a reckless relic endangering children and property values. And each time she spoke, I could feel the room lean toward the illusion of order she represented. Because chaos, dressed as authority, is comforting to people who don't want to think too hard. The lowest point came when the county issued a temporary notice of review that effectively froze my operations pending further investigation. Not because they believed her outright, but because it was easier to pause me than confront her. That letter sat on my kitchen table for hours before I could bring myself to open it fully. And when I did, the words blurred together, my hands shaking in a way they hadn't since the hospital called to tell me Sarah wasn't going to make it through the night. For the first time since this began, I thought I might actually lose. Not in some dramatic courtroom defeat, but quietly, administratively, through a process that would bleed me dry while calling itself neutral. Mackenzie was furious, but even she admitted this was the danger zone, where law bends toward whoever has the stamina and money to keep pushing. Cordelia sensed it too. Her emails grew sharper, less guarded, slipping into outright contempt, daring me to keep fighting, implying that surrender would be merciful, that selling out would be easier for everyone. I walked the pasture that evening as the sun dipped low. Taurus grazing nearby, the herd moving with the unbothered rhythm of animals who don't understand why humans complicate things so badly. And I realized that if I quit now, it wouldn't just be land I was giving up. It would be the last thing Sarah and I built together. The last place where her memory still felt solid instead of fragile. That realization hardened something in me. The next morning, instead of reacting to Cordelia's latest filing, Mackenzie and I went on the offensive. Not loudly, not theatrically, but methodically. We requested discovery on every complaint she'd filed, forcing her to produce evidence, Source: Timelines. We subpoenaed HOA financial records tied to the bike path project, expanding the scope beyond my property and into her management practices. We asked the county to consolidate hearings, eliminating her ability to drag things out piecemeal. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. Because bureaucracy hates being forced to look at itself all at once. Cracks started forming. Board members contradicted each other under oath. Contractors admitted they'd been instructed to proceed without full approvals. Emails surfaced showing Cordelia directing staff to push ahead and deal with resistance later. The narrative shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, from rogue rancher to rogue president. Media coverage followed that shift. Tentative at first, then bolder, framing the conflict less as progress versus nostalgia and more as power versus restraint. Cordelia reacted badly to losing control of the story. She held impromptu press statements, accused the county of bias, accused Mackenzie of manipulation, accused me of emotional exploitation, and each accusation sounded a little more unhinged than the last. When the final hearing was scheduled, the one that would determine whether the temporary freeze became permanent enforcement, I walked into that room expecting the worst, braced for the possibility that rules and reality wouldn't align in my favor. Instead, I watched as Cordelia talked herself into a corner, interrupting officials, dismissing procedure, insisting urgency excused overreach, revealing in real time the mindset that had fueled this entire ordeal. When the decision came down, it wasn't thunderous. No cheers, just a measured statement, the easement claim invalid, the complaints unsubstantiated, the HOA cited for procedural violations. The freeze lifted immediately. I didn't feel triumph so much as release, like a muscle unclenching after being held tight too long. Cordelia stood there, stunned, the first genuine crack in her armor finally visible, because for the first time, she couldn't bully, outtalk, or outpaper her way forward. The aftermath unfolded over months, not days. Civil suits moved quietly. Audits continued. Cordelia resigned before she could be formally removed, issuing a carefully worded statement about pursuing other opportunities. The universal language of forced exit. The bike path was redesigned entirely, routed along public right-of-way with full transparency and voluntary cooperation from landowners who now insisted on seeing every document twice. The community settled into something resembling peace, not because everyone agreed, but because the lesson had been learned the hard way. As for me, the ranch returned to its rhythms. Morning hay, evening checks, long conversations with no one but the wind and the memory of a woman who would have laughed at how absurd it all became. Sometimes I sit on the porch at dusk and think about how close I came to losing not just the land, but myself, and how easy it would have been to step aside and let someone louder decide my worth. But I didn't. And neither did the land. Taurus still grazes where he always has, massive and unbothered. A reminder that some boundaries aren't drawn on paper, but lived into existence over time. The story people tell now focuses on the bull, the Tesla, the spectacle of it all. Because that's easier than acknowledging the quieter truth underneath. That persistence matters. That grief doesn't make you weak. And that progress without respect is just another form of destruction. Wearing a cleaner mask, when the sun sets over the pasture and the light goes gold, I feel Sarah there in the stillness. Not as loss, but as presence. And I know that standing my ground wasn't about winning a fight. It was about refusing to let someone else decide when my story was finished. The decision didn't arrive with drama. No gavel, slam, or applause. Just a quietly worded notice posted to the county website on a gray morning that smelled like rain, stating that the investigation into Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association had concluded with findings of mismanagement, procedural abuse, and unauthorized use of easement claims. Followed by the line that mattered most to me: all actions taken against my ranch were formally rescinded. Permanently. With prejudice. I read it twice. Then a third time. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because I needed to feel them settle into my bones. The land was mine, without condition, without review, without the constant threat of someone else deciding it needed to be improved out of existence. Cordelia didn't attend the final public meeting where the findings were summarized. She'd already resigned by then, citing health reasons and personal priorities in a statement so carefully sanitized it barely resembled the woman who'd once sneered at me over a running bulldozer. Brad sold the Tesla remnants for salvage, closed out his accounts, and quietly accepted a job in another state. Far from HOAs and bike paths and ranches, he never understood. The house they'd lived in sat empty for months before a for sale sign appeared. And when it finally sold, it went for less than market value. A small but fitting consequence in a story full of them. The HOA board restructured under county oversight. New bylaws drafted with uncomfortable precision. Limits placed on authority that should have existed all along. And when the new president knocked on my door to introduce himself, he came without papers, without cameras. Just a handshake and an apology that felt awkward but sincere. We talked for nearly an hour, not about paths or property values, but about boundaries, about what it meant to move into a place and learn its rhythm instead of trying to override it. Construction resumed eventually, but this time the bike path curved gently along public right-of-way, skirting my fences instead of cutting through them. And I surprised myself by agreeing to install an educational sign near the bend, explaining rotational grazing and why cattle sometimes gather near fences at dusk. Watching cyclists slow down to read it for the first time felt stranger than any confrontation I'd had with Cordelia, because it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about being seen without being threatened. The lawsuits wrapped up quietly. Settlements signed, clauses buried deep enough that nobody could spin them into spectacle. And the money mattered less than the principle etched into every line. The land was not negotiable. Life returned to its familiar pace, in increments so small I barely noticed them at first. Fewer envelopes in the mailbox. Fewer nights lying awake waiting for another shoe to drop. The ranch breathed again. Taurus regained his full range of pasture. His massive presence once more. Just another fact of the landscape, instead of a talking point. And I found myself smiling one evening as I watched him stand beneath the old oak where Sarah's ashes were scattered. Flies flicked lazily from his flank, utterly indifferent to the chaos he'd unwittingly become part of. Grief didn't vanish with resolution. It never does. But it softened, changed shape, became something I could carry without stumbling. On quiet mornings, I still think of Sarah when the light hits the grass just right. And sometimes I talk to her out loud, telling her about the small things she missed. The way the creek rose after spring rains, the way the calves clustered close when storms rolled in. I like to think she would have shaken her head at the absurdity of it all, then laughed. The way she did when people mistook noise for importance, Willowbrook Heights settled into itself after the storm passed. Property values stabilizing, not because the land had been tamed, but because people learned the comfort of limits, the reassurance that not everything needed to be optimized. New families moved in who asked questions instead of filing complaints, who waved instead of recording, who taught their kids to count cows along the fence instead of warning them away. Every now and then, someone stops me at the feed store or the post office and asks about the bull, about the Tesla, about whether it was as wild as they heard. I tell them the truth, that the story everyone remembers isn't the important part. The important part is quieter, harder to explain, less shareable. It's the part where you refuse to step aside just because someone louder tells you your life is obsolete. The part where you let patience outlast pressure, where you understand that land, like memory, doesn't belong to whoever shouts the hardest. Some evenings, as the sun dips low and the pasture turns the same soft gold it always has, I sit on the porch and listen to the sounds I almost lost. Cattle shifting, wind in grass, the steady calm of something that endured. Progress didn't erase this place. It learned to move around it, and that, I've learned, is the only kind of progress worth trusting.